In this fourth audio, and in the next, I'm going to trace a rough outline of the history of U.S. Catholic higher education. In the second and third audios, I've really concentrated on providing a theoretical overview of what the larger mission of the Catholic Church is, what it involves in terms of specific activities, how those activities should be performed, who should perform them, and then what's the underlying motivation for engaging in mission. And as we saw, that gets us into how Christians understand life as a whole, what the world is or the universe is that we're living in, filled with the presence of God and marked by the purposes that God intends for the human race. All that was very general, and we have yet to really apply this to the realm of education in particular. And so with this audio, we'll begin to shift in that direction and start to consider how, while Catholic schools and universities are not churches, they are places that are deeply inspired by Christian principles and deeply committed to promoting the wider mission of the Catholic Church in all its different aspects. So we want to start to get into that, and in particular, we want to see what the story has been of Catholic universities in the United States, how they've carried forward that mission in service to their students, and how especially they've changed over time. In the second audio, I described how the Catholic Church on the whole quite profoundly rethought and expanded its understanding of what its mission is. So we've already seen a little bit of that history, but there is quite a bit more to get into. Catholic colleges and universities in the United States not only went through that change, but many others as well. And in particular, through various circumstances, the ability of Catholic colleges and universities to hold on to their mission has been under great strain for several decades now. The key shift, of course, has been the rapid decline in the number of religious order sisters and brothers and priests that used to staff Catholic universities and colleges. And so going back to my framework of the what, the how, the who, the where, and the why of mission, a lot of it has turned on a fundamental change in who is leading the mission. Who are those in the classrooms and in the administrative offices who are shaping the direction that the universities go in? And the whole point of this audio series, in fact, is to help equip those who now work at Catholic universities from whatever background to serve the mission. So that may be the biggest change of all, but there are many others as well, and it's important to go over this history so that one can see the present challenges and opportunities our universities face in some kind of context. So let me now start to tell the story, and what I'm especially hoping to do to begin it is to provide a picture of what Catholic colleges and universities typically were like in the United States right after World War II. There was a certain pattern they all followed and a certain culture that they shared. So I want to characterize that. And then I want to begin to describe a number of historical changes and developments that occurred that began to shift things. Vatican II especially, but others as well. So to begin, if we go back to the late 40s and 50s, what were Catholic universities like? And how do they see their mission? My description here is taken primarily from two historians, Alice Gallen and Philip Gleason, who have written the definitive works on this subject. And the first thing we need to know is that in the middle of the 20th century, Catholics were still trying to find their way here in the United States. They were largely not accepted. They were seen still as immigrants and outsiders. America was predominantly understood to be a Protestant nation, and so Catholics of different ethnic backgrounds lived set apart from the larger population. They lived in what's sometimes called the Catholic ghetto, and close-knit subculture of Catholic neighborhoods and parochial schools, churches, and extended ethnic families. The situation is similar to how many Muslim communities exist in the United States today. When 9/11 happened, I was a graduate student in Boston, and there was a local Middle Eastern man who ran a gas station. And once 9/11 happened, he put up about 50 little flags all around his gas station to advertise to everyone very clearly that he was pro-American and against the terrorist attacks. Catholics up through the mid-century fought a very similar battle. They were often trying to demonstrate to the wider society that they were all for American democracy. In fact, the Latin inscription above the local parochial school where I live now in Iowa, built in the early 20th century, reads Deo et Patria, God and country. And that was the message Catholics were always trying to communicate. Catholic colleges and universities were part of that larger subculture, and they operated in that similar closed environment. They were places where nearly all students were Catholic, and the same for the faculty and staff who ran the institutions. And as I mentioned earlier, those faculty and staff were primarily religious order, priests and brothers and sisters. And the atmosphere on these campuses tended to be warm and family-like, with a very strong sense of campus community rooted in pride in being Catholic. And so these places may have been closed and ghetto-like, but they provided a deep sense of belonging. Now, what did they provide? Well, certainly they provided training to meet the educational needs of aspiring Catholics, to help them earn stable incomes, and to help meet local community needs for higher education. And in this, they tended also to admit non-Catholic students. But they saw themselves providing a real alternative to secular higher education, especially for the vast majority of Catholics that made up the student body. The primary focus was to keep Catholics Catholic and support their faith as they would move on into the mainstream of American society. They aimed to pass on Catholic traditions and values and principles, and they encouraged mass attendance and Catholic devotional practices and participation in Catholic social action through service to the larger society and to vulnerable groups of people. The purpose of Catholic higher education, then, was certainly to provide the educational advantages Catholic families needed, but it was also to protect them in their practice of the faith. And U.S. Catholic colleges and universities had centuries of Catholic educational tradition to rely on. And that's worth pausing to appreciate. Going back to the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Catholic schools have valued and insisted upon the combination of the best secular learning with the teachings and practices of the Christian faith. These two things were seen as mutually enriching and necessary to equip people to live good lives. And so a classic Catholic education would include things such as math, reading, and writing, but also the humanities, classics, liberal arts, and the fine arts, along with rhetoric and other technical skills to help one succeed and operate in the public realm. And intrinsic to this holistic education was a real focus on moral formation, helping the student cultivate virtues, discern right from wrong, and ultimately find their vocation and calling in life, what it is that God is asking of them. And certainly all of this would include cultivating kindness and compassion, courage and temperance and justice towards others, and really all of the virtues that are needed for a flourishing life. So Catholic education was a highly value-laden education, and the content of the curriculum in many ways was perfect for drawing out that focus on morality, both the content of the humanities and liberal arts, which help students reflect on the great questions of life and the circumstances they'd face, and study of divine revelation, the teachings and wisdom of the Christian tradition, which point people towards the highest and most generous way of living. So this moral focus was very important and very explicit. And it also shaped how Catholic educators saw themselves, as well as their own task as educators. They saw it as very important for Catholic colleges and universities to create an educational environment where students felt supported and welcomed and affirmed in their essential goodness, and positively challenged personally and individually to reflect on their lives and look within and really search for the great thing that God wanted them to do with their lives. And as part of this, of course, the context of the Catholic faith offered opportunities for prayer and reflection, in the best cases, examples in the teachers and staff who had for themselves come to discern their own calling and who stood as representatives of God's love, models to encourage each student to become the best person they could possibly be in the world. So this was an extremely enriching kind of education. And in the first half of the 20th century, it had one other characteristic that historian Philip Gleason points out, and that was that it boldly challenged the secular modern world. Now, I mentioned already how Catholics in the United States were essentially seen as others, outsiders who did not quite belong. And though Catholics resisted by insisting that they were for American democracy and all for supporting the country, they were nevertheless not blind or unthinking in their support. They believed that American society and culture had important things to learn from them about the meaning of a good life and about a good society. In fact, according to Gleason, U.S. Catholics saw themselves as essentially opposed to the modern world. Catholics saw secular culture as flawed in many ways and possessed a strong sense of their own way of looking at the world and life as much better than the modern secular world. And so there was a real self-confidence there in Catholic culture, as much as Catholics also wanted to just be accepted in American society. Now let me note a few other characteristics of these schools as well. First, we can say that the colleges and universities were essentially run by the religious orders. So whoever happened to be the superior of the religious order also was the head of the institution, the college or the university. And in most cases, we're talking about religious order superiors, though there were also a few colleges and universities run by bishops. But in either case, what we now think of as the institutional church entirely directed Catholic higher education in the United States. There was little to no input from lay people. The institutions did not have independent boards of trustees. That would not begin to appear until the late 60s. And in terms of the running of these institutions, the word of the religious superior was law. The way these institutions were run was a lot like a family business. Problems and issues were dealt with from the top, and religious leaders did not hesitate to use their authority if there were certain members of the community, faculty, who did not quite toe the line in terms of how things were supposed to be done. There were very strict rules about not only student life in terms of speech and dress, but for faculty in terms of how they were to behave. If they were lay people who were divorced or remarried, they could be dismissed. And there was an expectation, of course, that all those teaching at the university would not say anything or teach anything that would contradict either the U.S. Constitution or the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church. And again, the fact that the U.S. Constitution is defended shows the importance for Catholics of showing their civic loyalty in American society. But in terms of the freedom of faculty and the influence of faculty to govern the institution, it was not what we normally see today. The older understanding of academic freedom was that if you agreed to abide by the principles and rules of the institution when you were hired, well, then that was fair. You are free to follow or not follow those rules. And with sister and father in charge, you could expect that if you weren't playing by the rules, you would be called into the office. And if you opposed church teaching or presented some other problem to the president, well, you shouldn't expect to get tenure. And so this was before the time in which things like tenure committees existed. And faculty on the whole, we can say, did not necessarily have doctorates. They typically did not engage in research. The focus for them very clearly was on teaching and on the moral and religious formation of their students. And in regard to student life, in this sense also, Catholic colleges and universities were a bit like family operations. The schools were single-sex, which was the standard and actually required mode of education according to the Catholic Church. Co-ed was not allowed. And Catholic families, in fact, were required to send their children to Catholic schools, whether that's on the primary or secondary or higher ed levels. The wider secular public world was seen as full of dangers, both religiously and morally, and so families followed suit, which provided a clear pipeline of students to Catholic institutions. In student life on the whole, that focus on the moral education of the student was essential, and again, exercised in a very familial way. Sisters and brothers closely oversaw student life, especially in the dorms, and they very much fit the role of parents. And so restrictions on student life were many, and it was interwoven with instruction in Catholic moral teaching and in the formation of individual conscience. This parental oversight could be tender and compassionate and inspiring in the best cases, and at times a bit heavy-handed and legalistic. The Catholic environment on the whole had its elements of authoritarianism and clericalism and moralism overall. And this could get in the way of promoting mature individual freedom, questioning, and intellectual growth. On this point, in fact, there was a very strong internal critique of Catholic colleges and universities in the United States, best expressed in 1955 by John Tracy Ellis in an essay entitled American Catholics and the Intellectual Life. And Ellis's critique was that for all the riches of the Catholic intellectual tradition, Catholics were living too much in an intellectual ghetto in the United States and were not at all distinguishing themselves by producing scholars or matching their Protestant peers in their academic and intellectual contributions. Ellis pointed out there was too much smugness and complacency in literate American Catholic circles. American Catholics had real pride in being Catholic, but the downside of this at times was a kind of anti-intellectual triumphalism or a kind of close-minded dismissiveness of the intellectual gifts of the wider secular and Protestant world around them. And a lot of this, in turn, just goes back to the immigrant nature of most Catholics in America at the time, who were poor and struggling and often didn't have the resources to invest in developing their own intellectual gifts. An easy target of this critique of Catholic culture as anti-intellectual was the neo-scholastic core curriculum of most Catholic colleges and universities. This was simultaneously a point of pride and a source for concern. The neo-scholastic core curriculum was a heavy load of philosophy classes that all students took. At Clark University, in the middle of the century, it was 7 classes, and this was quite normal. Most students, in addition to whatever else they studied, earned something between a minor and a double major in philosophy. But this, by and large, was not the kind of philosophy that's studied at Catholic universities today. It was a form of Thomistic philosophy, or philosophy based on the approach of Thomas Aquinas. And we might think of it really as a fusion of religion and philosophy that Catholics had developed to respond to various critiques of Catholicism and to defend the faith in a very rational way against the various dangers of the modern world. At its best, it attempted to integrate all learning and thought in connection to a philosophy and outlook on life in which the truths of belief in God and the fundamentals of the Catholic faith had a primary place. And so this was one of the most important tools that Catholic educators sought to exercise to help keep Catholics Catholic. The problem was that it had a lot of flaws. Often students found these courses to be boring and irrelevant, disconnected from other subjects in the curriculum, dry and formalistic, and leaving out a great many things that are part of the human experience. And so even though it had very high aims in seeking to intellectually outfit Catholics to see life as a whole and face the modern world, it didn't always live up to its promise and was often critiqued from within, especially by the brightest Catholic minds. So John Tracy Ellis's critique landed on this neo-scholastic core curriculum as well and led to efforts to reinvigorate it and improve it. Now, with regard to the specifically Catholic element in the curriculum, the other thing we need to mention is the required religion courses. And these were provided to serve the faith lives of the Catholic students, to instruct them in morals and in the teaching of the faith. These were not the more academic college-level theology or religious studies classes that we're used to today. They were confessional in nature. That is, they assumed the Catholic faith of the student body, and they continued the catechesis or basic instructions that these students had received at an earlier age. These courses, therefore, complemented the entire moral and religious environment of Catholic colleges and universities. And as with the neo-scholastic philosophy curriculum, they were required and supplemented the students' other courses of study. So, to sum up, we can say that in the era after World War II until approximately 1960, Catholic schools had both strengths and weaknesses compared to how mission is now understood in the Catholic Church. On the side of strengths, Catholic institutions did a great deal to lift up and elevate young Catholics to take their place in the workforce and in American society. And they provided a strong moral education and a deep sense of belonging within the Catholic fold. And the faith lives of students was very well supported. Catholic colleges and universities were places where students were nurtured in their faith and saw models that they could live up to. So vocations to the priesthood and religious life were very strong. But the Catholic tradition in which students were formed within the universities also had some weaknesses. The holistic education was there, with sights set on forming and serving the needs of the whole person. But this was also before Vatican II and before the dignity and calling of each individual Christian in their vocation to the world was affirmed. This was there, but not as strong as it could be. The focus on keeping Catholics Catholic was worthwhile, but in some respects, it overlooked the possibilities of a wider call to improve the world. And again, I don't want to overemphasize this point because it's not like this was entirely absent. It's just that Vatican II would make this much more prominent in the recovery of Jesus' notion of the kingdom of God, which hadn't yet come into focus. So the Catholicism of the day, in some ways, was still a bit too focused on soul saving, in the sense of the priority being remaining part of the church and thus having the means of salvation available to one. So the Catholicism of the day was not yet open to seeing salvation outside of the Catholic Church and in other religions and in the wider culture. So in that sense, the perspectives operative within these institutions were narrower and more church-centric. And this fits with the negative views of the world outside the church and some of the anti-intellectualism that I mentioned. But as communities, they were strong, and for what they saw themselves aiming to accomplish, they were well equipped to do it. The communities on the campuses were cohesive. They shared a common culture and vision, marked by all those assumptions about the meaning and purpose of life that I described in the last audio under the heading of the morally significant Christian vision of the world. That vision was a shared cultural and religious inheritance and a strong source of common identity among students, faculty, and staff. And it enabled them to work well together and towards a common purpose. That sense of common identity and the life of these institutions overall, however, would soon undergo rapid change. So let me move on now to the next chapter in this story, the changes that took place in the Catholic higher ed environment and how all of these put great strain on the religious identities of Catholic institutions and brought questions about the nature of their mission front and center. There are many different kinds of changes to go through. I've already introduced some of the major theological changes that happened at Vatican II, so I will make reference to those. But changes occurred in other fields as well. There were changes in wider American society and culture, especially in the 60s. There were economic challenges. Internally, there were efforts of Catholic universities themselves to make them more fully part of the mainstream of American higher ed, so more intellectually respected. There would be changes in terms of staffing and curriculum and in student life. And there would be new relationships with the wider Catholic Church, with bishops, and with the Vatican, especially its Congregation for Catholic Education. And all of these changes tended to come right around at the same time, through the 1960s into the early 70s. And so it was a period of tremendous ferment and even upheaval, and the leaders of Catholic institutions did their best. But almost all of the pressures tended to challenge the Catholic nature of these institutions and tended to diminish the religious influence overall. So by the early 1970s, Catholic identity was, along with fiscal stability, the primary concern of leaders of Catholic colleges and universities. So let me now start to move through a number of these changes. And I'm going to take them in no particular order because a lot of them occurred simultaneously, and many of them, in fact, had roots back in the 50s. But to begin, let me talk about financial challenges. Practically all Catholic colleges and universities were enrollment-driven institutions with little to no endowment. And yet with the GI Bill and the baby boom, there was an enormous expansion of higher education institutions and a great influx of students of all kinds. And Catholic institutions, like other institutions, responded to meet the need, building buildings and expanding programs of all kinds. And many institutions took on debt during the 50s and 60s to meet this need. And they relied on grants from the federal government of different kinds, and this was before the time in which the government would offer loans directly to students, and so it was individual Catholic institutions applying for federal aid from the government. From 1966 to 1971, Catholic institutions did not breathe easy because there was a secular challenge from a group called the Horace Mann League, which saw an absolute separation of church and state and did not want any Catholic universities to receive any federal money at all. So there were a number of court cases, and then the key one was one known as Tilton versus Richardson. It wasn't settled until 1971, and the outcome was that Catholic universities on the whole could receive money from the federal government as long as they were not, quote, pervasively sectarian, unquote. And to avoid this label of pervasive sectarianism, a religious institution would have to have theology courses that are academic and not intended to indoctrinate. They would have to be open to non-Catholic students and non-Catholic faculty. And they would have to not require students to attend religious services. And again, this was a court case settled in 1971, and by that point, Catholic universities on the whole pretty much met those standards. So they were able to receive federal dollars. You could be a religious institution and receive federal money. You just couldn't be pervasively sectarian. But those legal challenges lasted from 1966 to 71, and during that time period, it was really up in the air. And so Catholic universities were really caught in this position of wanting to hold on to their religious identity and mission, and yet also wanting to prove their worthiness within the American higher education system in terms of serving the needs of society as a whole and respecting people's religious freedom. And the early years of these legal challenges, of course, overlapped with Vatican II. So by the time the case was decided, the Catholic Church was already very clearly moving in a more open direction with regard to the wider world, an embrace of non-Catholics, non-Christians, and non-religious people, an affirmation of the religious freedom of every person, and a desire to teach and to share, but never indoctrinate. But the external pressure, nevertheless, was really there from the government and from these legal challenges. It was a pressure not to be too religious in any way which might give the perception to others of being pervasively sectarian. So informally, the lawyers supporting Catholic universities encouraged them to drop some of their devotionalism or anything else that might appear religious in a way that was excluding of others. Now, a very important part of the strategy that Catholic institutions took to deal with these challenges had to do with altering their leadership structure so that they were not seen as controlled by the Church. And as I mentioned, up to this point, most Catholic universities and colleges were founded by religious orders, and so the religious order itself, especially the superior, had control over the institution. But beginning with the University of Notre Dame in 1967, Catholic universities, within a matter of just a few years, significantly altered their relationships with their founding communities by instituting lay boards of trustees. And what that did was essentially set the universities up to run themselves versus being run by the religious congregations. And this was a way of demonstrating to the wider American higher ed environment and to the government that the institutional church was not controlling these institutions. Now, there's a lot more to say about this very important change in Catholic higher ed because it had significant consequences for the ability of institutions to say that they were Catholic. Up to this point, you could say that you're Catholic if you're a ministry of the religious order. But now being separated from the religious order, what did this really mean? And this is a very complicated issue that continues to this day, actually, and I'll come back to it in a later audio. Suffice it to say that Catholic university presidents welcomed this development, partly because they saw it would help them run their institutions better, and also because it provided an opportunity to bring lay people onto the boards of trustees who were needed as fundraisers and people who could provide technical expertise in various areas. Now, simultaneous to this were some important changes with faculty. During the post-war boom in higher education, schools expanded and hired more lay faculty. And as their numbers expanded, and as the culture of the 1960s developed in an anti-institutional direction critical of authorities, and as faculty at Catholic institutions became more aware of the different kind of standard of academic freedom in other institutions, faculty then began to press for changes. They wanted more of a voice in shaping the curriculum and in governance of the institution. And to match this, as Catholic institutions' own ambitions were to be seen as outstanding places of higher education, they began to hire those who they believed would fulfill those ambitions for them. Excellent scholars, or those with an outstanding academic pedigree, but maybe not the best candidate for passing on what had been the traditional religious and moral formation of students. In fact, the emphasis on increasing the academic excellence of Catholic institutions led to an emphasis on the identity of faculty being primarily defined by the standards of their own discipline. So there was a shift in faculty loyalties to professional identities shaped by their field as understood in the wider American higher ed environment, and not so much by the particular Catholic university traditions. So there was an expansion through the 60s and 70s of new committees on which faculty had a voice, the writing of employee handbooks, and an adoption of the meaning of faculty having academic freedom in the way it was typically understood across American higher ed. Catholic universities dropped their older definitions of academic freedom. So in terms of hiring and granting tenure, faculty took on more and more responsibility, and questions of maintaining the religious dimension and mission of the university were in a great many cases lost in this transition. And for a while, because of the legal challenges against Catholic higher ed receiving federal money, at many institutions it was not clear whether they could have a preference for hiring Catholics. So as all these changes accumulated through the 60s and into the early 70s, it was clear that the new lay voice was quite significant in terms of the directions these universities were going in. So across Catholic higher education by the mid-70s, there were many discussions about how the universities and colleges could maintain their Catholic identity given the new role and influence of faculty, many of whom had degrees from secular universities, and most of whom may not necessarily have been formed or formed well either in the mission of the Catholic Church as a whole or in the kind of education that Catholic universities had typically tried to provide. And in some cases, there began to be outspoken faculty who were not only indifferent to the Catholic mission of the institution, but even hostile to it. The 1960s and 70s also saw dramatic declines in religious vocations. Between 1966 and 1975, for example, there were 5,000 priests that resigned across the United States, and similarly huge numbers of women religious. Catholic institutions adapted in the only way they could, which was to hire more lay people to fill the roles that the priests and religious had filled in the past. Now, we shouldn't think that the new influence of lay people or of lay people with more of a secular or non-Catholic background was entirely unwelcome. In fact, it wasn't. Vatican II brought a more positive view of both of these. First, the role of the laity in the mission of the Church was now affirmed in an entirely new way. In the past, lay people were only really seen as having a mission insofar as they participated in the mission of the hierarchy of the priests and bishops. Now lay people were seen as having a vocation in their own right and a distinct mission in the Church. So why shouldn't they have greater say and role in the operation of Catholic universities and other institutions? They should. At the same time, as I mentioned in the second audio, Vatican II brought an entire new appreciation of other religions, other Christian denominations, and of the wider secular world. The older, sweeping rejection of all of these was set aside and replaced with a more nuanced understanding that the Church should open its doors because it had things to learn from other Christians, other religions, and the wider cultures of the world. So that older, combative, critical, even triumphalistic stance of the Catholic Church towards the outside world was replaced with a new kind of openness. Now, to some extent, the openness that followed in terms of the implementation of Vatican II can perhaps be seen as too wide open, and in some cases, too uncritically accepting of the beliefs and practices of those outside the faith and the Church. There's a great deal that can be said on that on many, many different topics. But regardless, the Church insisted that it would move forward with openness and with a basically receptive, positive, and affirmative stance. This willingness to see values outside of the Church was quite a change. And it was sometimes embraced with an attitude that was self-critical of the Church and of the past that led to not just healthy questioning of prior positions and views, but a occasionally sweeping and unhealthy repudiation of the past and of various authorities within the Catholic Church. And once again, that pertains to a wide array of subjects which it's impossible to really generalize about. The new openness on the whole was seen as very positive, but in every area of church life it would be important for that openness not to be so open as to evacuate the core commitments of the tradition that have animated Catholic life for 2,000 years. A new balance would need to be struck in lots of different areas. So as all these changes that I've already mentioned were taking place, the wider environment within the Church was encouraging newness and experimentation and openness and also freedom, personal freedom. And this was another new development in Vatican II. the recognition granted to individual conscience and the dignity of each person's search to discern goodness and truth responsibly and to hear God directing them individually. This new emphasis on the sacredness of individual conscience goes with the recognition in part of the vocation of the laity. Now, all of these new developments would have very important consequences for Catholic higher education, and one other one to add here is the profound new ecumenical openness of the Catholic Church, meaning that Catholics were now encouraged to see their Protestant and Orthodox brothers and sisters as exactly that, brothers and sisters in Christ, fellow Christians and followers of Jesus, and the Catholic Church wholeheartedly encouraged its members to draw close to other Christians and to get to know them, to learn from them, and to contribute towards the wider movement towards Christian unity. This very new and open attitude contributed not only to non-Catholic faculty being hired at Catholic universities, but to an ending of the old requirement that Catholic families needed to send their children to Catholic schools. Families could now send their children to secular and public institutions. On the other side, there would now be a new kind of embrace of non-Catholic students at Catholic universities. Attention to them given in the curriculum and in student life and in admissions offices. So the student body would begin to change and change rapidly. And in an important development that had nothing to do with Vatican II, but perhaps fit the spirit of change in the air, and most of all met some of the money pressures institutions always faced, Catholic colleges and universities started to switch to co-ed to make sure that they had enough students to stay afloat, and in disregard of the traditional prohibition against this in church teaching. This fact, compounded by the youth culture of the 60s and early 70s, which emphasized individual freedom and choice, the questioning of authorities and of older moral principles, well, it led to not only barriers being broken, but some older taboos being broken too, and new lifestyles, which in some cases ignored the traditional moral teaching of the faith. So the older form of student life on campus, marked by the sisters and brothers and priests and other staff having a parental oversight with the desire to positively shape the moral and religious lives of students, that was backed away from. Students protested against those strictures, and schools began to take more of a hands-off attitude in this respect, and in large areas of freedom for students, just as they had done for faculty. So the older, more cohesive and tight-knit culture of Catholic institutions began to become much more diverse. In the 70s, in addition, there was more of a desire for students to come and study in various professional programs. In this and in other respects, they made demands not only about life on campus, but about the shape of the curriculum. And for the first time, they started to be seen as customers, in part because many of them were there with a narrower focus simply to get prepared for their careers. So if we combine the changes that occurred in the body of the faculty and in the student body, there was an accumulating shift away from the traditional moral and religious education that had been provided. There was certainly a great deal of good in the new level of diversity and the focus on academic excellence and academic freedom, but there was also a noticeable loss of cohesion, which led, among other things, to new positions in student affairs to create programs and in other ways to build cohesion. And there was a very palpable sense that the Catholic dimensions of the institutions were either slipping away or, in other respects, very uncertain. Prior to the 1960s, Catholic colleges and universities were very clear about what they were up to and how they were expressing their Catholic identity and mission. But from the late 60s onward, this would no longer be the case, and Catholic universities would be continually dealing with the question of what they were about in terms of their Catholic mission and identity, and how they were going to carry that forward and ensure it into the future. So much that had been stable and clear and that had worked in the past was swept away or up for questioning. A whole other area in which change occurred is in regards to the curriculum, particularly the religion and philosophy curriculum. Through the 60s, these were seen together as supporting the moral and religious formation of students. But with Vatican II and the old critique of the neo-scholastic philosophy classes, there was a questioning of older methods in teaching these and a search for newer ones. And in regard to the study of religion, it opened up into the more sophisticated kinds of theological studies that previously had not been taught at Catholic universities. Even more critically, there was a move away from seeing religion courses as really serving the function of religious education for students in the older sense. Instead, faculty presented their courses as purely academic in nature, and so the new term of religious studies to designate courses of this kind took root. These courses were not confessional in nature, and if they addressed Catholic teachings, faculty insisted they had a right to criticize those teachings. More broadly, though, religious studies courses addressed other religions and the phenomenon of religion generally, and many other broad topics. There would be new experiments and a lot of fermentation in the teaching of theology at Catholic universities, and the results were mixed. There was no standard pattern with regard to what students at different schools learned. And as many have observed, the Catholic dimension suffered as a result. With regard to the teaching of philosophy, there was a similar upheaval. The old neo-scholastic curriculum disappeared almost overnight. But what it was replaced with was primarily philosophy as a separate academic discipline without necessarily that old goal of integrating students' knowledge and serving students of faith. Philosophy, in many respects, would continue to be seen as having a very important role with respect to the Catholic identity of the institution, but not every kind of philosophy class always served that identity, or at least not directly. Just as important as these changes in the content of theology and philosophy classes was students' exposure to them. There were continual calls to reduce the number of required courses, and with philosophy they fell significantly and quickly, and in theology they also fell, to the point where in both cases there was nothing at all comparable to the strong core curriculum that had existed prior to the 1960s. Theology and philosophy might be seen as having a prized and central place in the curriculum, but it was definitely a reduced place, with a much smaller influence on the student body. In sum, one can see that the magnitude of the changes Catholic colleges and universities faced from the 60s through the 70s was absolutely enormous. And it directly challenged and altered what had been a very thick and self-assured and clear and confident Catholic culture. The changes were so many and they came so quickly that it's fair to say that leaders of Catholic higher ed didn't quite see what it was that they were losing and letting go of, in many cases before it was too late. Through the 1970s, the concerns continually mounted. The fear, very legitimate, was that the institutions had accommodated too much to the wider culture, become secularized, and were becoming more and more indistinguishable from their secular and public counterparts. The old consensus about who they were and what they were about, what they stood for and the kind of education they provided, was now quite far gone. What would replace it? What would distinguish a truly Catholic education in this new era, with these new students and with the very new workforce that had been hired? This question of identity would more and more become an urgent one, and it's the purpose of the next audio to begin to explore how Catholic colleges and universities began to answer it, in dialogue with each other, with leaders of other Catholic universities around the world, with U.S. bishops and sponsoring congregations, and with the Vatican.